The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, The Keys to Remembering What You Read. My name is Ann Dolin, and today we're going to be talking all about reading comprehension. I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about how to participate in the webinar. On the right of your screen, you're going to have a control panel. The orange arrow allows you to expand or minimize the panel. Everyone will be muted, but you will be able to hear me, of course. If you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to post them into the questions chat box below. The presentation will be about 25 minutes, and then we'll have an additional 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. Although we'll save Q&A for the end, please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation. All right, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Ann Dolin, and I've been in the field of education since 1991. I started out as a Fairfax County teacher in both general and special ed. And in 1998, I left the county to start my own tutoring business, something I felt passionately about, working one-to-one with students. I'm also the author of Homework Made Simple, Tips, Tools, and Solutions for Stress-Free Homework. With me today, I have Allison Clark, who at Educational Connections works as our content coordinator. So she helps us skim the latest research to submit to our tutors, letting them know what's going on in the field of education. And she also helps to push out that new research to our listserv in the form of blogs and webinars as well. So welcome, Allie.
Hi, everyone.
Let's talk about the basics when it comes to reading. I like to kind of think of reading as taking a trip. You know, before you go on a vacation, you just don't show up. You plan it out. You think ahead. And when you're there, you take pictures. When you come home, you revisit those pictures, you look through, and you reminisce thinking about what a great time you had. It's kind of the same with reading. You know, you never just start a book with word one. A good reader who really wants to improve comprehension takes a few minutes to read the back of a book. They might read the inside panel of the novel. The idea is to get an idea of what you're going to read before you actually read. And in fact, previewing is the #1 reading comprehension strategy students can use. It's a little bit different for textbooks. With textbooks, you want to preview, but it's great because publishers make it easy for you. Usually they have a synopsis of the chapter at the very beginning. The problem is sometimes students don't stop to read that. They just kind of get started. But it's always a good idea to read that basic information at the beginning. And also to preview the questions at the end of the chapter. That gives you a framework for the important things to look for. We also encourage students to look at questions, to make subtitles into questions. So if the subtitle, for example, is 5 Causes of the Revolutionary War, they make that into a question. What were the 5 causes of the Revolutionary War? And then attempt to answer that question as they read. I also like the idea of using Spark Notes or Cliff Notes before getting started, especially for a novel. Sometimes students think it's cheating if they look at Spark Notes, but actually it's a really good idea, especially if the student is struggling with comprehension. The reason we like to use these resources is not really to read the Spark Notes instead of the book, but it's to get a framework. So it's kind of to give context. What are you about to read? Reading that quick synopsis of a chapter before you even delve into it is really something that is often very helpful to many students. Self-talk is equally as important. You know, we've all experienced this issue when we're reading in bed at night and we get to the end of the page and we think, oh my gosh, I have no idea what I just read. And the reason is we're thinking about other things. We're thinking of the 15 things on our to-do list. But as adults, we often realize, oh, I have no idea what I've just read. So we go back and we reread the page. Sometimes kids don't do that. They don't know what they've read at the end of the page, but they keep on reading. I once asked a student who had a habit of doing that, why do you keep reading? And He was a middle schooler, and he said to me, well, eventually I think it's going to make sense to me. So I think that if I just keep reading, it will all come together at some point. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work like that. So it's important to engage in self-talk. Self-talk is the idea that when you get to the bottom of a page or you get to the end of a part of the chapter, you say to yourself, what's important here? And you jot down that important information. You can do it a couple of ways. One is margin notes. I like margin notes because as you're reading, you can quickly jot down some important things in the margins. And if you can't write in your book, you can use Post-it notes. Allie, do you want to talk a little bit about Post-it note summaries?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our tutors actually shared a really great idea with me not too long ago, and she uses Post-it note summaries for kids who are a little black and white, who have a hard time reading text and really pulling out what's important, the kids who need more specific questions. So on every Post-it note, she has the kids write who, what, when, where, and why. So it's very specific questions, and she has them put them at the end of each section as they're reading. So if they come to a stopping point, they stick a Post-it there, and they take about a minute or two, and they fill out that little Post-it, and they really just capture what they just read. And if for any reason they can't fill out any of those little questions, then they go back and they pull that information again.
I love that idea. It provides a little bit more structure. So now, instead of making reading just a visual task, which is really what reading is, you're just looking, you're using your eyes to get information. Now you're making it tactile or kinesthetic as well by the writing process. And next to previewing, writing down notes is the other most effective habit you can use to improve comprehension. Now, you can even make it more multisensory by discussing what you read. And I love the use of technology these days. I've worked with a lot of students, probably more in the last 5 years, that instead of just reading and taking notes, they're also taking the opportunity to use FaceTime or Skype. And after they read a chapter, they're getting online with their friend and they're discussing it. Anytime you discuss what you've read with a peer over Skype or FaceTime, face-to-face in class, you have a study group, you converse with your tutor, now you're making it multisensory. And anytime something's multisensory, you're more likely to remember it. There's a lot of research to support it too. This is one of my favorite studies. This study looked at 7th and 8th graders who were taking a science class, and the researchers wanted to see in what way do students really retain written information the best. So the researcher broke the kids up into 3 separate groups, and each group was shown 5 sets of words on a computer screen. Each set contained 12 words. So the students had to learn these words. They didn't have to know the definitions. They simply had to memorize the words. And group 1, after seeing the words, they were told to take a break. So after the words flashed upon the screen and they saw a total of 5 sets, they were told to take a break. And we all know that breaks are good. Breaks can help kids kind of consolidate information. The second group was shown the words once, the 5 different sets, and then after a minute, they were shown the sets again. So this group saw the words twice. The third group was shown the words once, and then they were instructed to write down as many words as they could remember. They were all given quizzes 3 hours later. So the question is, which group did better? What do you think? Here's what the research shows. On the graph, you can see that the bar on the left, preliminary, is the test that they took 3 hours later. Now, these students were also a whole month later instructed in the same way. So the first group was shown the words again and they were to take a break. The second group saw the words twice. And then the third group, again, right before they took the test again a month later, they were told to write down what they remembered. And what the researchers found is that the break group, that first group, the first time around, they remembered about 40% of the words. And on the final quiz a month later, they remembered just a few more than that. So not really much of a difference. The group that reread, that saw the list twice, scored about 33% on the first quiz and about 43% on the second. But clearly the winner was the third group. They remembered about 81% of the words the first time and 83% of the words the second time. And the reason is, anytime you write down information, you're really cementing it into a memory in a different way because you're employing tactile features. Now you're using two modalities instead of just one. Here's the problem. The problem is that most students use the second method to study. In fact, 84% of kids study by rereading. But the problem is it's not effective. Far and away, the task of writing down the information you learn or read is the best way to retain information. It's the most accurate. So group 3 used active reading strategies. And in real life, active reading strategies are things like we just talked about. They're margin notes. They're those post-it summaries that Ali discussed. It's even making quizzes out of chapter subheadings. So if the chapter subheading is 5 causes of the Revolutionary War, what were the 5 causes of the Revolutionary War? Closing your book and writing down what you think they were, and then going back to see if you're right and filling out that answer. It's also creating practice tests for yourself based on your notes, and it's using study guides effectively. There's research that shows using study guides twice is far more effective than using once. So for example, your teacher gives you a study guide. You don't want to fill the study guide out and reread it a couple times. That's not effective. What you want to do is print out a new copy of the study guide that's not filled in and fill it in again. You can even do it 3 times. A lot of our tutors have kids do it 3 times, but they do it a different way. They will cut out the parts of the study guide, the questions, and they'll rearrange them so that students aren't just simply memorizing the sequence, but they are also learning it out of sequence and really solidifying that information into long-term memory. But sometimes reading can be overwhelming, and active reading does take time. So kids can decide, how do they want to break this down? And many students will either break down reading by time or task. So, for example, if you have a really reluctant reader and that student has to read a chapter in their book, instead of saying, and procrastinating, I have to read this whole chapter, which can seem daunting, they can break it down by time. Time might mean setting a timer for 20 minutes, and they say to themselves, I'm going to read as best I can and focus as well as I can for just 20 minutes while they take notes. By task would mean the student says to himself, I'm just going to read pages 23 to 27. That's it, and I can take a break and go back to it later if I want to. Ali, do you want to talk a little bit about skimming?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of kids, especially once they get into high school, are tempted to skim because they just have so much reading. If you have a student who's taking even one AP class, but if they're taking more than one, it can be very overwhelming, the amount of homework they're getting. So a lot of kids just, their default is to skim. But what the research tells us is that skimming doesn't really work. And the reason is you're not picking out the important details in the reading. Everything, you're just skimming over it. So what kids can do to do something called smart skimming is they want to gather that context before, whether it be through looking at what the key notes are in the chapter, or what the key takeaways are, or going on something like Spark Notes and figuring out what are the most important scenes. And they want to read those key important details or scenes really closely and actually thoroughly read those. And then other things they can skim a little and read a little less in detail. So for example, if your student is reading Les Mis in AP English, they don't need to read the 45 pages of Jean Valjean walking through the sewer, but they do need to read some of those really important scenes. And then at the end of those scenes, they want to, again, ask themselves the questions to make sure they understand and that they didn't just skim everything.
Great. Thanks, Ali. One of the issues that kids these days face is that their textbooks are online. And there's actually a lot of research now looking at, how do kids comprehend better? Is print reading easier for kids than online? And far and away, we know that retention of information online isn't nearly as good as when they read text from a printed version. So in general, students score lower on comprehension tests when they are reading online. Specifically, when reading novels, students don't have a sense, they don't have time markers as much as holding the text. So when they have to retell a story and put events in chronological order, when they have to sequence events in a story, they're not nearly as accurate as when they're reading a text, a book that they hold in their hands. One of the reasons we think this is so is that when you're holding a book in your hand, you can kind of see, oh, I'm a quarter of the way through this book, or I'm almost to the end of the chapter, or, oh, I'm right at the climax. So you can kind of get a feel almost for where you are in the story. And that is actually an issue that we see when kids are holding a Kindle that they don't really have. So many students, are very aware. Many kids will say, you know what, I just don't focus as well online. And there are things that they can do. Some of the online books are really great, and they have features that are very helpful to students. So the ones with note-taking tools are especially good because students, just like margin notes you write down with hand, they can type in their notes on the page as they go. A lot of kids will order a used copy of their textbook. And sometimes students will print out a chapter and they will physically annotate that chapter with pencil and paper. They like the feel of that better and they're more focused. So one parent had the question, typing on an iPad, does that meet the same sensory needs of handwriting to fill in a worksheet? And the answer is no, not really. An interesting study was done looking at college students during a lecture class, wanted to see, do students remember more when they handwrite notes or when they take notes on their laptop? And the answer was handwriting. Handwriting is incredibly powerful, and you remember more when you handwrite your notes as opposed to type them. However, in this day and age where everything is electronic, certainly typing notes is absolutely fine, but the key is you must review them within 24 hours. And if you're going to take notes, either by hand or typing those notes, taking time within that 24-hour period to look to kind of synthesize and boil down what are 2 to 3 sentences for each page that really summarize the detail of what you've learned. Anytime you have to paraphrase information, you're kind of having to put it in your own words, and that helps you remember too. In terms of audiobooks, for younger kids, there is some research that shows a couple of things. One is that when you have a reluctant reader and the child wants to read a book just slightly above their grade level, but they're not quite ready. For example, let's say you have a third grader who, really, really wants to read The Strange Case of Origami Yoda, but it's kind of hard for him. And you're not sure if he reads it on his own, if he's really understanding it. One technique you can use is to buy the audio version of the book, but also have a version, either handheld or could be on the Kindle, but handheld is better, where your child follows along as he listens to the story out loud. But it can't be that he's listening to the story and kind of daydreaming, not following along the book, but if he's tracking the words in the book and listening to the audio version. Studies show that those students improve comprehension and fluency more than the students who simply read the book slightly above their level without any support. There's also some research that looks at the size of fonts when kids are reading, and we do know that the larger the font for kids that do struggle through reading, the better. So not a huge font, but sometimes just slightly larger than the font they may typically see. And you have that feature to enlarge on the Kindle. That makes reading easier for many students. So before we go into Q&A, I wanted to wrap up by sharing with you a couple of resources that you might find to be helpful. We have some easily downloadable ebooks. Our most popular is Helping Your Disorganized Student. Three things parents can do to reduce homework stress, and also school success with kids with ADHD. If you have a question right now, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Allie, what are some things that parents are asking?
So I think one question that came in, excuse me, that seems to come up a lot is how can parents help their kids learn to read in between the lines? For those kids who are really black and white and they don't get it, how can they help them kind of get that, understand what's being said beneath the surface?
We see that a lot. Usually kids can get by with suspect comprehension through elementary school and sometimes in middle school, because a lot of the questioning is still fairly black and white. What year was this person born, or what was the event preceding his death? Those things are really obvious in text, but sometimes there's things that are not so obvious, like what is the author's tone, or why do you think the character did this, or what do you think could happen next? One of the questions that I think is really great to ask yourself as you're reading is, so what? When you're reading something, why does this matter in the first place? Why is the author telling you this? And the reason is usually that event connects to something before or something right after. And if you can answer this so what question, that usually helps you to uncover a deeper meaning.
Great. And when kids are doing the so what, can they do that for both novels and textbooks?
Oh, certainly. With textbooks, it's really helpful. I think it even works better that way because, especially in history, for example, if you're talking about, something, a General Braddock, and his interactions with George Washington, well, it's important because, that relationship really defined George Washington's career. And anytime you can say, why is this relationship important, or, anything like that, that's going to really tell you the theme of history, for example.
And one question that's come in from parents of students who are different ages in elementary and in high school is, how do you handle a reluctant reader, a kid who just hates reading?
When they're little, I never think the idea of sending your child to their room to read is a good one, because I can bet you can go up a half hour later and your child is playing with Legos, your daughter is dressing up her dolls. It just doesn't work well. Reluctant readers are not going to take initiative. So as parents, when they're younger, we can sit down with them and do something like, you read a page, they read a page, or for a really reluctant reader, you read 2 pages, have your child read a page. Also, the choice of books is really important. A lot of parents will say, I don't want my child reading comic books, or I'm so sick of Diary of a Wimpy Kid, or I don't like Bone. Those books are fine. If that opens the door to your child, go for it. Eventually your child will move on. And usually those kids that like comic books will eventually get into nonfiction. A lot of them like war history, but letting them take the lead on the book they choose is fine. Even a magazine, Sports Illustrated for Kids, for example, is okay as well.
And one question that just came in is, how do you recommend parents work with students who have working memory issues when it comes to reading?
Well, working memory means kind of juggling a few things in your head at the same time. So, an easy way to think of working memory is if you say to your child, all right, go to your room and put your coat on, get your mittens, and by the way, don't forget to brush your teeth. It's likely that your child will brush his teeth, but will come downstairs without the coat and mittens. So keeping something in your mind is working memory. It's not short term, it's not long term, it's kind of in the moment. And working memory is really huge in reading because you're having to think about a lot of things. You're having to think about what's going on in the plot at that point, what happened before, what could happen next, how the character is feeling, what is the author trying to say in the first place. And for kids that have working memory, reading comprehension is almost always an issue. It's usually the case that these kids are actually very fluent readers. We see this all the time, especially students with ADHD. They read just fine. So their issue is not decoding or sounding out words or fluency. It's really getting to the root of understanding. And the best strategy for kids with working memory is really active reading. They have to take the time to pause, to reflect, to self-talk, and to take that minute to jot down what's going on because they cannot keep everything in their mind. And they need, it's kind of like taking a picture as you go on your vacation. When you get to the end of that section in the chapter or the end of the chapter in a novel, you need to go back, be able to go back and see the notes you've written down because that's kind of like a surrogate working memory almost for your brain.
So for the kids who have working memory issues or who struggle with reading comprehension, should parents, especially when they're younger, help them plan out their reading schedule?
Sure. Is the question, should you sit down and, plan ahead and kind of break things down?
Yeah. How do you help your child kind of learn these strategies?
I really like that idea. I always like Sunday nights as a good way of planning. And anytime you put something in writing, it's far more powerful than a verbal reminder. So you can even say to your student, all right, honey, this week you're going to read chapters 1 and 2 in your book because, you got to get that book finished or get that book report done at the end of the month. Yeah, Mom, don't worry, I'll do it. In one ear and out the other. Anytime you want your child to do something, especially when it comes to reading, having it in writing is far more powerful. So on your refrigerator, if you have a simple calendar and it's very clear, chapter 1 on Monday, chapter 2 on Tuesday, something like that, your child is far more likely to cooperate. I like the idea of planning ahead on a Sunday night for the week coming up. But keep in mind, if you have a reluctant reader, you're probably going to have to sit with your child and have him read out loud to you and discuss it as you go. Kids with comprehension issues will often, I explained the example earlier, you get to the end of the page, you don't know what you read, you keep on going. When left to their own devices and not engaging in self-talk, kids will keep on reading. They'll get halfway through the book and they will not know what they've read.
And I know one thing our tutors do is they will have the student read a page, the tutor read a page, and then they talk about it as they go, just so that way it's very active. But that's only for really younger kids. Now, one mom just wrote in and she said, how do I keep my daughter's love of reading alive while she struggles with comprehension? She reads a lot, but doesn't really remember any of it.
Yeah. Memory is interesting when it comes to reading. Many students will have serious comprehension issues when it comes to anything that's not at all entertaining to them, especially as kids get older. They have to read their biology text and they have no clue what they've read. Interest is a huge motivator when it comes to reading, and interest is a primary factor when it comes to comprehension. So anytime your student has a choice and they can read, if your daughter loves horses and she can read a book about horses, I can tell you she will remember more and her comprehension will be better in the book about horses than anything else that's forced upon her or a textbook she has to read. So allowing your child to pick something within her interests and then also at a slightly lower level is a really good idea. I like the 5-finger rule. It's kind of basic. It's been around for a long time. And the idea is if your child mispronounces 5 words on the page, 5 fingers, 5 words, the book is too hard. Even 4 words, it might be challenging. But kids with comprehension issues, even if they're mispronouncing a couple of words and not really understanding, or even 1 word, the book is still too hard. So dial it back. Find an easier book at a lower level, but one that looks like it's still on their level, not too babyish, to keep your child engaged. The way you improve comprehension is really by starting at a lower level, kind of like you run a marathon. You don't just go out and run a marathon if you're not a good runner. You're going to start with, a quarter of a mile, and you're going to build up from there. Kids with comprehension problems have to practice on text that is below their level at first to learn the strategies before they can really get it under their belt to employ on more difficult text.
So, Anne, if you're reading with your child and you see that they're really, really struggling to pronounce words or to comprehend what they're reading, at what point should a parent be concerned and what should they do?
I think a parent's intuition is actually a really good guide. If you see that your child really hates to read, they've always struggled to read, you've heard from their teacher, they just need to put forth more effort, or, if Mary would just read more, she'd be a good reader. Those are all red flags. The research shows that by the end of first grade, if kids are struggling readers by the end of third grade, they're likely to be struggling readers at the end of third grade. And by the end of third grade, we pretty much know if the child is going to have a lifelong reading problem. And so you really absolutely have to catch it early. If you're seeing red flags with your child, not wanting to read, having difficulty with grade level work, really struggling over words or meaning, those are red flags early on. If your student, has gone beyond that, you have a fifth grader who is still really struggling over reading. It's very laborious. It's very consuming. It's very tiring. Sometimes when it's not a comprehension issue, but it's actually an issue of just mechanical reading, those are students that do well with a program to treat the decoding issue. One of the programs we use quite frequently is called Wilson, the Wilson Reading System. And that's a program that helps kids not as much with comprehension, but really to learn how to break down multisyllabic words and read a lot more fluently.
And I wanted to ask you for your opinion on something that happened the other day to me. And I was talking to a mom, and she needed a tutor for her son, but she said, he has so much reading, I don't know how do I check that he's doing it? Because she would sit with him. Her son was in 11th grade, and she'd sit with him when he was doing his homework to make sure he was doing it, because otherwise he wasn't turning it in. And she said, I don't know if he's actually doing his reading. How can I check?
That's a tough one, because hopefully, fingers crossed, you don't want to have to be checking your child's homework when they're a junior in high school. That question is often more common with younger students. A lot of times elementary students will have a reading log, and they're supposed to read, say, 20 minutes a day. And as a parent, you don't really know if they've read 20 minutes a day. So I'd kind of treat those kids like an audit, just like the IRS audits your taxes. You say, every now and then I'm going to come up and I'm going to read with you and we're going to discuss. Probably not every night, because I'm not going to be able to do that. But, periodically I'm going to come up and we're going to read together. Do I have an agreement that you won't fight me on this, that we can do this together? Oh, sure. Or yeah, I guess so. And that's auditing reading is a better idea if you can't read with your child on a regular basis. But in general, as kids get older, you want to try not to be as involved with homework. One thing that I've done that's been helpful with my own son, he's in 7th grade. He really, he's all about his friends. He's all about his social network, and he's not as much about school. And that issue came up in our house, where sometimes, when there's no checks and balances, he would be fine, to forget something and not turn it in. And so now, on a nightly basis, he has to show me his completed work and then bring over the laptop so he can verify it with Blackboard. So he pulls up, for example, the homework his English teacher has assigned, and he just shows me that it's completed. So I don't ask to check everything. I just want to see that it's done. And so it's kind of like and then for that, he gets a check. And the check he can trade in for a privilege, a weekend social privilege, or even hanging out with a friend, a Chipotle after school, something like that. But in terms of reading, the best way to check in on that is actually to read with your child, or just simply ask them, tell me about what you read. What's important? What are you doing in class involving that book?
And a mom just wrote in and said, is it okay for kids to read at bedtime? I've heard different viewpoints.
I think it definitely is. I'm not sure of what the research says on it, but I like the idea of reading at bed. I think it really, really relaxes kids, especially if it's fiction. Sometimes reading something that, especially nonfiction, that can kind of, get you agitated isn't a great idea. Certainly maybe not textbook reading, but anytime you're reading for pleasure, I like that, especially in this area where it's just so darn competitive and people get stressed out all the time. Giving kids a way of coping with stress by reading at night can be a very powerful tool.
And then the last question that we're going to talk about today is about the resources page.
Mm-hmm.
So one mom asked, are the resources on this page will they help kids in college? So 20 years older and up.
Usually I'd say that the things that we publish are mostly for elementary, middle, and high school students. So the Disorganized book is probably elementary, middle. Homework stress is all, K to 12, and school success for kids with ADHD can also be used for college students. That's a compilation of blogs on best practices for ADHD. So absolutely, you may find a few things in there for a college student with ADHD.
And just to follow up to that, we have a ton of other blogs on our website, which is ectutoring.com. And we also will be republishing this webinar in case you missed parts of the beginning. And it looks like we just had one follow-up question to the question about reading right before bed. Does reading on a Kindle or a Surface or an iPad, does that impact sleep?
Yes, certainly. So kind of going back to the question, the parent said, is it okay to read before bed? I was thinking in my old-fashioned way of holding a book, having a paperback or a hardcover book in your hands. Actually, if your student is going to read electronically, that is not a great idea unless they're reading a Kindle with the blue light turned off. And there are versions that are not bright, that don't have the glare of a computer screen. They're softer on the eyes, softer on the brain. There's a ton of research that's come out recently looking at the effects of being online, whether it's reading a novel or surfing the internet at night, and it does activate kind of the wakeful part of the brain. So instead of winding down, your brain starts to wind back up. I like the idea of reading before bed, but it's probably best if it's a book like a hardcover book or a softcover paperback.
All right. Well, that is it for all the questions, Anne.
Great. Excellent. Well, I hope that you got some good ideas. I left my email here for you. It's ann@ectutoring.com. If you have any specific questions about your child, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm more than happy to respond. Hope you got a few tidbits from this. And as always,